On a bright, crisp morning, the sound of fluttering wings broke the stillness in the Turner family's backyard. Margot, sipping her coffee on the porch, first noticed the crow when it swooped down from the nearby oak tree and landed near the garden bed. It was an ordinary black crow, large, sleek, and alert, but something about it caught her eye. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. In its beak, it held a glinting, shiny object, catching the morning sunlight in such a way that Margot couldn't help but lean forward and squint to see what it was. She watched as the bird hopped around the edge of the garden, turning its head from side to side, before casually dropping the object onto the soft soil. It wasn't the first time Margot had noticed this crow. Over the past few days, it had become a regular visitor to their garden, always arriving at around the same time, just as the morning dew began to evaporate. What intrigued Margot more than the bird's punctuality was its peculiar behavior. Every time it visited, it seemed to carry something shiny. The previous day, it had left behind what looked like a piece of tinfoil. A week earlier, Margot had spotted a small metal washer among the flowers, which she dismissed as something one of the kids might have dropped. But now, with this second and third visit in as many days, the strange coincidence was becoming harder to ignore. "Hey, Paul," Margot called over her shoulder, keeping her eyes fixed on the bird. "Come look at this." Paul, her husband, was inside the house, distracted by his work emails. He heard her call but didn't quite register it. He was already late for a conference call. "What is it, honey?" he replied, half-heartedly. "Just come here for a second. I think this crow is up to something." Margot's voice was filled with a mix of amusement and curiosity. She hadn't intended to get so caught up in watching the bird, but something about the way it appeared day after day, leaving behind these little trinkets, made her feel as though there was a pattern. And Margot had always been a sucker for patterns. Paul, sighing but intrigued by his wife's tone, set his laptop aside and stepped out onto the porch. His eyes followed Margot's pointing finger to the crow, which had now perched itself atop their birdbath, its sharp black eyes darting around, surveying the garden like a watchful guardian. A small glint on the soil near the garden bed confirmed what Margot had been talking about. A shiny object lay where the crow had been moments earlier. "Looks like your friend left us a little gift again," Paul said with a chuckle, half expecting Margot to laugh it off. He started to turn back inside, dismissing the bird's behavior as typical of crows, curious and sometimes a bit mischievous. But Margot's expression didn't mirror his lightheartedness. "No, seriously. It's been doing this for days now," Margot said, her brow furrowing. "I thought it was just picking up scraps or something, but I'm starting to think it's leaving these things on purpose." Paul paused, noticing the seriousness in her tone. He stepped down from the porch, walking over to the garden bed. The soil was dark and damp from the morning watering, and sitting just on top was what looked like a small, smooth piece of metal. He crouched down and picked it up, wiping away the dirt with his thumb. "It's a button," Paul said, inspecting the object more closely. It was an old-fashioned brass button, the kind you'd find on a vintage coat. He raised an eyebrow and stood up, tossing the button between his fingers thoughtfully. "Huh. That's odd." "I told you," Margot said, a triumphant smile creeping onto her face. "It keeps bringing things. First it was a foil wrapper, then a piece of string, and now this." Paul glanced back at the crow, which was still sitting on the birdbath, watching them intently. The bird's glossy black feathers gleamed in the sunlight, and its beady eyes reflected an intelligence that seemed almost unnatural. It tilted its head as if it knew they were talking about it. "Do you think it's just scavenging and dropping random stuff?" Paul asked, trying to make sense of it. "Or could it really be leaving these things for us?" Margot shrugged, but there was a glint of excitement in her eyes now. "I don't know. But it's weird, right? Like, it's happening too often to just be random. Maybe it's trained to do this?" Paul laughed, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "What, like someone's pet crow?" "I don't know, Margot. That seems far-fetched." But the longer he stood there, holding the brass button, the more he couldn't shake the odd feeling that Margot might be onto something. After all, crows were known for their intelligence and for their tendency to collect shiny objects. But leaving them behind, as if offering gifts? That was something he hadn't heard of before. As they stood there, puzzling over the crow's behavior, their son, Lucas, burst through the back door, dragging his worn sneakers across the wooden porch. "Mom! Dad! Did you see the crow again?" Lucas was 12, and ever since Margot had pointed out the bird's strange habit a few days ago, he'd been obsessed with watching for the crow's visits. He'd even set up a small GoPro camera near the garden, hoping to catch the bird in action. "It left another shiny thing," Margot said, holding up the brass button for Lucas to see. "Whoa, cool!" Lucas exclaimed, bounding over to examine the object. "What do you think it means?" Margot and Paul exchanged glances, neither of them sure how to answer. "Maybe it just likes collecting stuff," Paul offered. "Or maybe," Lucas said, his eyes widening with excitement, "it's trying to tell us something." Margot chuckled. "Like what?" "I don't know," Lucas said, his mind already racing with possibilities. "But I bet if we follow the crow, we can figure it out. Maybe it's leaving clues." Paul raised an eyebrow. "Clues? What, like a scavenger hunt?" "Exactly," Lucas said, his face lighting up. "What if it's leading us to something? You know how crows are super smart, right? Maybe it found something, and it wants us to follow it." Margot couldn't help but laugh, but there was something about Lucas's enthusiasm that resonated with her. "I don't know, kiddo. That seems like a bit of a stretch." "Maybe," Lucas said, undeterred. "But you can't deny it's weird, right? I mean, look at this button, it's not just random trash." Paul looked at the button again, turning it over in his hand. Lucas had a point. It wasn't a crumpled piece of foil or a broken washer. This was something deliberate. "All right," he said, handing the button to Lucas. "Why don't we keep track of the things it brings? See if there's a pattern." Lucas nodded eagerly, already sprinting back to the house to grab his notebook. As he dashed away, Margot and Paul stood in silence for a moment, both staring at the crow, which hadn't moved from its perch. It ruffled its feathers and let out a low caw, as if in response to their scrutiny. "I feel like we're in some kind of mystery novel," Margot said, half joking. "Yeah," Paul agreed, but the unease in his voice was clear. "A crow bringing shiny gifts? What's next, a treasure map?" They laughed, but the seed of curiosity had been planted. Over the next few days, Margot, Paul, and Lucas watched the crow's behavior with renewed interest. Each day, it returned with a new object, a small, silver key, a rusted coin, a piece of polished glass. Each item seemed more deliberate than the last, as if the crow was leading them somewhere. Lucas was convinced the bird was leaving a trail of clues. Margot, who had initially brushed off her son's theory, was starting to wonder if there was more to it than simple coincidence. Paul, though still skeptical, couldn't deny the strange pattern that was emerging. One afternoon, as they were sitting outside, watching the crow's latest offering, a small, engraved key, Margot turned to Paul, her face thoughtful. "What if Lucas is right?" Paul glanced at her. "Right about what?" "What if the crow is leading us to something? I mean, look at these things, it's like they're pieces of a puzzle." Paul stared at the key in his hand. It was old, its surface worn smooth from time, but the engraving on it was still visible. "But leading us to what?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. "What could a crow possibly know that we don't?" The family didn't give the crow's initial visits much thought. At first, it seemed like a fleeting curiosity, just another bird in their garden. It was a typical Saturday morning when Maggie, the youngest daughter, noticed the crow for the first time. She was sitting at the kitchen table, gazing out the window, when she saw the bird land with a glint of silver in its beak. It dropped something near the rose bushes and flew off, its black feathers blending into the blue sky as it disappeared over the fence. Maggie blinked a few times, unsure of what she had just seen. "Mom, there's a crow in the garden," she said, her voice trailing off as she continued to stare outside. Her mother, Sarah, didn't even glance up from the dishes. Crows are always around, sweetie. Probably just looking for food. But Maggie wasn't convinced. Something about the way the crow had dropped the shiny object seemed too deliberate. She got up from her chair and wandered outside, curiosity getting the better of her. The garden was peaceful, with morning dew still clinging to the petals of the roses and the faint hum of bees collecting nectar in the distance. As she approached the rose bushes, she spotted the object lying on the ground, a small, polished stone with intricate engravings that sparkled in the sunlight. Maggie picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It was smooth, unnaturally so for something that might have come from nature, and the carvings on it resembled symbols or letters she didn't recognize. She ran her fingers across the stone, feeling the craftsmanship that had gone into creating such a thing. She furrowed her brow, wondering how the crow had come to possess such an item. She brought the stone back inside and showed it to her mother, who wiped her hands on a towel and took a closer look. "That's odd," Sarah muttered, examining the engravings. "Where did you say you found this?" "The crow dropped it in the garden," Maggie replied, her eyes wide with excitement. Sarah raised an eyebrow, a little more interested now. She placed the stone on the counter and glanced out the window. The crow was nowhere in sight. "Crows do like shiny things," she said absent-mindedly, "but I've never seen one carry something like this." Over the next few days, the crow returned. At first, its visits were spaced apart, and each time, it brought another small, shiny object with it. Once, it was an old coin, weathered and worn, its edges smoothed by time. Another time, it was a piece of glass, polished and perfectly round, reflecting the sunlight like a miniature lens. Each time, the bird landed in roughly the same spot near the roses, dropped its treasure, and flew off without so much as a caw. The family, intrigued by the crow's strange offerings, started to keep a watchful eye on their garden. It became something of a game to see what the bird would bring next, though none of them could make sense of why it was doing this. The objects themselves were odd, but they didn't seem to have much in common apart from their shininess. Some were old, others newer, and none of them appeared to have much monetary value. It wasn't until the crow's visits became more frequent that the family began to grow uneasy. The bird was no longer showing up once or twice a week, it started visiting every day, always with something in its beak. One afternoon, Sarah came home to find the crow sitting in the garden with what looked like a silver bracelet dangling from its beak. This time, the object was unmistakably valuable. The bracelet was delicate, adorned with tiny gemstones that glimmered in the sunlight. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she rushed outside to inspect it. The crow dropped the bracelet at her feet and flew off before she could react. She picked it up, the cold metal warming in her hands as she studied the intricate design. It was far too valuable to have been lost casually. Sarah's mind raced. Had the bird stolen it from someone? And if so, from whom? She glanced around, half expecting someone to come running into her yard, accusing her of theft. But no one came. The street was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic. Sarah took the bracelet inside and placed it alongside the other items the crow had brought. The collection was beginning to look like a magpie's treasure hoard, small, shiny, and inexplicably diverse. Coins, stones, pieces of metal, and now, this bracelet. The unease in her chest grew as she wondered what it all meant. Could it be just a coincidence that the crow kept bringing these things? Or was there something more deliberate behind its actions? That night, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, poring over the objects with a magnifying glass. She inspected each one carefully, trying to find a pattern or clue that might explain the crow's behavior. Her husband, Mark, joined her after putting the kids to bed. "You're still at it?" he asked, raising an eyebrow as he sat down beside her. "I can't stop thinking about it," Sarah admitted. "There's something odd about this whole thing. It's almost like the crow is trying to tell us something." Mark picked up the bracelet and turned it over in his hands. "Maybe it's just a really smart bird," he said with a shrug, though even he sounded uncertain. The items the crow had brought were far too specific to be random. He placed the bracelet back down, leaning forward to examine the collection. "This one," he said, pointing to the stone Maggie had found on the first day, "this looks like it could be something old. Maybe it's worth showing someone." The following morning, Sarah decided to take the stone and bracelet to an antique shop in town. She knew the owner, Mr. Fletcher, who was known for his vast knowledge of historical artifacts and curious finds. When she arrived, he greeted her warmly and invited her to sit as he examined the items she had brought. "This stone," he said, holding it up to the light, "is quite old. These engravings are not just decorative, they're runes, possibly Celtic. It could be part of something larger, like an amulet or talisman." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. The idea that the stone had ancient origins made the crow's behavior even more bizarre. "And the bracelet?" she asked. Mr. Fletcher turned the bracelet over in his hands, squinting at the tiny gemstones embedded in the silver. "This is Victorian," he said finally. "Mid-19th century, if I had to guess. It's in remarkable condition, though. I'd wager it belonged to someone of significant wealth." Sarah's mind raced as she processed this information. Why was the crow bringing such valuable and historically significant objects to their garden? She thanked Mr. Fletcher and left the shop, her heart pounding in her chest. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. It was clear now that the birds' actions weren't random. But if that was the case, what did the crow want from them? When Sarah returned home, she told Mark and the kids what she had learned. The revelation that the objects were both ancient and valuable left the whole family stunned. "Why is it doing this?" Maggie asked, her voice filled with awe and a hint of fear. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But we need to keep a closer eye on that crow." The next day, the crow returned, and this time it wasn't alone. 2 more crows joined it, circling overhead before landing in the garden. Sarah watched from the window, her breath catching in her throat as the original crow dropped yet another object, this time a key. But not just any key. It was old, tarnished, and intricately carved, with a pattern that matched the runes on the stone. The family gathered around the window, staring in disbelief. The crow cawed loudly, as if trying to get their attention. It hopped around the key, pecking at the ground before flying up to perch on a nearby tree, watching them intently. Mark was the first to move. He stepped outside, slowly approaching the key. The crows didn't scatter, they just watched him, their black eyes gleaming in the sunlight. He picked up the key and turned it over in his hands, noticing how heavy it felt for its size. Without a word, he brought it inside, placing it on the kitchen table next to the stone. "It's got to mean something," Sarah said quietly. "Maybe it opens something." They searched the house, testing the key on every lock they could find, but none of them fit. Frustration began to set in until Maggie had an idea. "What about the old shed?" she suggested. The shed had been there since they moved in, an old wooden structure at the edge of the garden that they rarely used. It was locked, but they had never bothered to open it, assuming it held nothing of importance. Mark grabbed the key and headed outside with Sarah and Maggie close behind. As he inserted the key into the rusted lock on the shed door, it turned smoothly, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The door creaked open, revealing a dusty interior filled with forgotten tools, old furniture, and an old chest tucked away in the corner. It was small, but its ornate design caught Sarah's eye immediately. She knelt down and wiped away the dust, revealing carvings that matched the stone the crow had brought. "This is it," she whispered. "This is what the crow wanted us to find." Mark and Maggie stood behind her, their eyes wide with amazement. The chest was locked, but the crow's key fit perfectly, and with a soft click, the lid lifted open. Inside, they found a bundle of letters, old photographs, and a handful of coins. As Sarah carefully removed the items, she realized that they had uncovered something far more valuable than they had ever expected, a hidden piece of history, brought to them by a mysterious crow with a purpose they still couldn't fully understand. On the 5th day of the crow's visits, the family was prepared. Initially, they'd observed the crow's behavior with bemused curiosity, snapping pictures and making playful guesses as to why it had chosen their garden as its daily stop. But this day felt different. There was a quiet sense of anticipation in the air, as if the crow itself was building up to something. Every morning for nearly a week, the crow had swooped down from the skies, its glossy black feathers gleaming in the sunlight, and dropped a shiny object onto the same patch of grass by the flower beds. It started with ordinary trinkets, bits of foil, a bottle cap, a shard of glass, but slowly the items became more intricate. The crow, once dismissed as just a clever bird with a penchant for collecting, was now regarded with awe. It had a method, a purpose that the family couldn't quite place, and today they were determined to get to the bottom of it. The crow arrived as expected, but this time it didn't immediately drop its offering. Instead, it perched on the garden stone wall, staring intently at the family as if it was waiting for something. Jasper, the father, felt the weight of its gaze. He had grown used to the bird's visits, but today its dark eyes seemed sharper, almost expectant. "Do you think it wants something from us?" asked Clara, Jasper's wife, as she wiped her hands on her gardening apron. She had always been the more pragmatic one, but even she couldn't deny there was something odd about the crow's behavior. "I'm not sure," Jasper replied, squinting at the bird. "But it's definitely waiting for us to do something." Their daughter Lily, who had been the first to notice the crow's daily appearances, suggested they take a closer look at what the bird had been bringing. "Maybe there's a pattern to the things it's dropping," she proposed, her young mind eager for an adventure. The idea made sense, and together, they collected the small pile of shiny objects the crow had delivered over the past few days. Spread out on the patio table, the items looked like nothing more than a jumble of junk at first: a rusty coin, a crumpled bit of metal, a small keyring. But as they studied them more closely, Jasper noticed something strange. The items, while seemingly random, had one thing in common: they all looked old. Not just worn from weather or time, but ancient, as though they had been hidden away for decades, forgotten until now. It was the keyring that caught his attention. Among the assortment of objects, the keyring looked the most unusual. It wasn't the kind of cheap trinket you'd find discarded on the street. It was made of brass, heavy, and shaped like an old-fashioned skeleton key. Jasper picked it up, feeling its weight in his palm, the cold metal smooth but tarnished with age. "This doesn't seem like something a crow would just find lying around," he murmured, turning the keyring over in his hand. His fingers brushed against a small engraving on the side, barely legible under the layers of grime. He wiped at it with the hem of his shirt, revealing what looked like initials: AW. "Do you think it could be part of something bigger?" Lily asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "Like a treasure?" Jasper smiled at her enthusiasm but couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she might be onto something. The crow's behavior was too deliberate, too purposeful. It wasn't just hoarding random items, it was bringing them to this exact spot, every day, like it was trying to lead them somewhere. "Maybe it's trying to tell us something," Clara said, her voice laced with curiosity. "It's almost like a scavenger hunt." Jasper stood up and walked to the part of the garden where the crow had been dropping its shiny offerings. The crow still perched on the wall, watching him closely, its head tilted slightly as if it was waiting for him to make the next move. He knelt down, running his hands over the soft earth. It had rained the night before, and the ground was still damp and pliable. His fingers brushed against something hard just beneath the surface. "Help me dig here," Jasper called to Clara and Lily, who quickly joined him. Together, they clawed at the soil, and after a few minutes of digging, they uncovered the rusted corner of an old metal box. The box was small, about the size of a shoebox, and its hinges were caked with dirt and corrosion. It looked like it had been buried there for years, maybe even decades. "Do you think the crow knew this was here?" Lily asked in awe, wiping the dirt from her hands. "I don't know," Jasper admitted, still staring at the box in disbelief. "But it sure seems like it." Carefully, Jasper pried the box open. The hinges groaned in protest, and a cloud of dust rose into the air as the lid gave way. Inside, they found a collection of old, yellowed letters and a bundle of photographs, all tied together with a faded ribbon. The letters were brittle, their edges frayed with time, and the ink had faded to a faint brown, but the handwriting was still legible. Jasper picked up one of the letters and unfolded it carefully. As he read the first few lines, his breath caught in his throat. "These are love letters," he whispered, glancing up at Clara, whose expression mirrored his surprise. "From someone named Amelia." "To someone named William," Clara added, reading over his shoulder. "A.W." The initials on the keyring suddenly made sense. As they sifted through the letters and photographs, a picture began to form, a love story between two people, Amelia and William, who had lived in the house long before Jasper and his family moved in. The letters spoke of secret meetings in the garden and promises of a future together, but they also hinted at something more, a hidden treasure, kept safe in the garden for when the time is right. "They must have buried something here," Jasper said, excitement creeping into his voice. "Maybe the crow has been trying to show us where." The crow let out a sharp caw, as if in agreement, and Jasper couldn't help but feel a strange connection to the bird. It was as if the crow had been entrusted with a secret, one that it was now sharing with them. "But where?" Clara asked, looking around the garden. "This could be anywhere." Jasper picked up the keyring again, holding it up to the light. The skeleton key, though tarnished, still looked functional. His eyes scanned the garden, landing on the old shed in the corner, a structure they had barely paid attention to since moving in. "What about the shed?" he asked, standing up. "It's been locked ever since we bought the place, and we never found the key." Clara and Lily followed him to the shed, their excitement palpable. The crow flapped its wings and took off, landing on the roof of the shed with a soft thud, its beady eyes watching their every move. Jasper approached the door, his heart pounding in his chest. The lock was old and rusted, much like the keyring, but it hadn't been tampered with in years. He slid the keyring into the lock, and with a satisfying click, the door creaked open. Inside, the shed was musty and filled with cobwebs, but in the center of the floor was a small trapdoor, barely visible beneath layers of dust and debris. "Do you think this is it?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jasper nodded, his pulse quickening. He knelt down and lifted the trapdoor, revealing a small, hollowed-out space beneath the floorboards. Inside was a second, larger box, its surface etched with intricate patterns and symbols. Carefully, Jasper pulled the box out of the hole and placed it on the ground. The crow cawed again, its call echoing in the still air, as if urging them to continue. With trembling hands, Jasper opened the box. Inside, nestled among velvet-lined compartments, were pieces of antique jewelry, a collection of rare coins, and a few small gold bars. At the very bottom of the box was a note, written in the same elegant handwriting as the letters. "For our future together, when the time is right. Love, Amelia." Jasper sat back on his heels, stunned. The crow had led them to a treasure, hidden for generations, waiting to be uncovered. "I can't believe it," Clara whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It's real." The crow fluttered down from the shed roof, landing gracefully beside them. It let out one final caw before flying off into the distance, its mission complete. As Jasper watched it disappear into the horizon, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of awe and gratitude. The crow, for reasons he still couldn't fully understand, had brought them together with a piece of their home's history, revealing a secret that had remained hidden for decades. The family sat in silence for a few moments, absorbing the weight of what they had just uncovered. They had been led on a journey, guided by a creature whose intelligence and purpose defied explanation. The crow had opened a door to the past, and in doing so, it had given them a gift they would never forget. Jasper smiled, feeling a strange connection to the bird that had brought them here. Whatever the reason, the crow had chosen them, and now their lives would be forever intertwined with the legacy of Amelia and William, and the shiny objects that had led them to this incredible discovery. The family stood frozen in place, hands caked with dirt and hearts racing with a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. The small, locked chest they had unearthed was no ordinary find. Its wooden surface, though weathered and cracked with age, bore intricate carvings along the edges, symbols they didn't recognize, but which hinted at something valuable, something ancient. The crow, which had been watching them with its beady, calculating eyes, swooped down from its perch on a nearby branch, landing softly on the patch of disturbed soil. It was silent now, in stark contrast to the series of caws and fluttering sounds it had made earlier when it had appeared to guide them to this exact spot. For weeks, the crow had been delivering shiny objects to their garden, scraps of metal, bottle caps, broken jewelry, and once, a mysterious, old key. Each time, the bird had dropped its prize at their feet or near the garden shed, as if urging them to understand the message it was conveying. And now, as they stared down at the locked chest, that message was finally becoming clear. "Is it possible?" Alice whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling the trees. Her husband, Tom, stood beside her, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the key in his pocket, the very same key the crow had delivered just days before. He hadn't given it much thought at the time, assuming it was another random trinket the bird had picked up. But now, standing before the chest, he understood, the key wasn't random at all. It had been chosen specifically for this moment, for this chest. Tom hesitated, glancing at Alice and their two children, Katie and Ben, who were wide-eyed and silent, watching intently. The crow remained still, its head tilted slightly to the side as if observing the scene with as much curiosity as the humans. Taking a deep breath, Tom knelt down and inserted the key into the rusty lock. At first, it resisted, the metal groaning in protest after years of disuse. But with a gentle push and twist, the lock clicked open, releasing its hold on the chest. A collective breath was held as Tom slowly lifted the lid. It creaked, the sound harsh and grating, as if the chest itself were reluctant to reveal its contents after all these years. When the lid finally swung open, a faint musty smell wafted into the air, mingling with the earthy scent of freshly turned soil. Inside, nestled among layers of decayed velvet lining, was a collection of objects that made their hearts race with both awe and confusion. At first glance, the items seemed mundane: old coins, tarnished jewelry, and a bundle of yellowed papers tied together with a faded ribbon. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell. But as they carefully pulled each object from the chest, the significance of what they were holding began to dawn on them. "These coins," Tom muttered, holding one up to the light. They're old. Really old." Alice took one from his hand, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the metal. The coins were unlike anything she had ever seen. Each bore strange markings and unfamiliar inscriptions, none of which she recognized. They weren't modern currency, that much was clear, but where had they come from? And why had they been buried in their garden? Ben, always the inquisitive one, reached for the bundle of papers. He untied the ribbon with careful hands, his brow furrowing in concentration as he gently unfolded the brittle sheets. The first page contained what appeared to be a letter, the ink faded but still legible. "It's addressed to someone named Edward," Ben said, his voice tinged with excitement. "It's written in old-fashioned handwriting. I think it's from the original owner of this house." Tom and Alice leaned closer, peering over Ben's shoulder as he began to read aloud. The letter told the story of a man named Edward who had lived in the house many decades ago. Edward had been a collector of rare artifacts, treasures he had accumulated during his travels across Europe and Asia. The chest, it seemed, was a part of his collection, a secret one, hidden away for reasons that became clearer with each sentence. "He was afraid someone was after him," Ben continued, his eyes widening as he read. "It says here that he buried the chest because he feared for his life, that someone was trying to take his treasures. He didn't trust anyone, not even his closest friends." Alice exchanged a glance with Tom. The story was beginning to take shape. Edward had buried the chest to protect it, but he hadn't lived long enough to retrieve it. The crow's involvement, however, remained a mystery, at least, for now. As they dug deeper into the chest, they found more clues. The jewelry was not merely decorative, each piece seemed to hold historical significance, with engravings and symbols that hinted at royal connections. One necklace, in particular, caught Alice's attention. It was a delicate silver chain with a pendant shaped like a crown, adorned with tiny gems that sparkled faintly in the sunlight. Upon closer inspection, she noticed a name engraved on the back, Catherine. This is from a royal family," Alice said, her voice trembling. But how did it end up here? Tom shook his head in disbelief. It must have been part of Edward's collection. He must have acquired it during his travels. Katie, who had been silent until now, spoke up. But what about the crow? Why did it bring us here? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. The crow, still perched nearby, cawed softly, as if acknowledging its role in the unfolding mystery. Its presence had been constant throughout the discovery, almost as if it had been guiding them to this moment. And then, as if sensing the family's growing confusion, the crow did something unexpected. It flew down to the chest and nudged one of the coins with its beak, pushing it toward Tom's hand. Tom picked it up, examining it closely. The coin was unlike the others, made of a darker metal and inscribed with symbols that looked almost arcane. "I think this is the most important piece," Tom said slowly, his mind racing to connect the dots. "The crow's been after this all along." Alice furrowed her brow. "But why? What's so special about this coin?" They pondered the question in silence, but no clear answer presented itself. It was only when they turned their attention back to the letter that they found a possible explanation. "There's another part here," Ben said, flipping to the second page of the letter. He began reading again, his voice steady but tinged with excitement. "Edward writes about the coin specifically. He says it's cursed." A chill ran through the group. "He believed the coin was responsible for the misfortunes that had befallen him," Ben continued. "He thought it was drawing people to him, dangerous people who wanted to steal his treasures. He buried it in the hopes of breaking the curse." Tom frowned. "A cursed coin? That sounds far-fetched." But Alice wasn't so sure. What if the crow knew? What if it's been watching over this place for all these years, waiting for someone to find the chest and break the curse? The idea was outlandish, but after everything they had experienced, it didn't seem entirely impossible. The crow had been too deliberate in its actions, too focused on the shiny objects it had brought them. And now, standing here with the chest open before them, the crow was still watching, silent, but attentive. "We need to do something with it," Tom said, his voice firm. "We can't just leave it here." "But what?" Alice asked, her mind racing. "We don't even know what the curse is or how to break it." Ben glanced down at the letter again. "There's one last part," he said. "Edward mentions that the coin must be returned to where it came from. He doesn't say exactly where, but he gives a clue, the place where the crows gather, where the sun meets the stone." The family exchanged puzzled looks. "Where the crows gather?" Katie repeated. "What does that mean?" The crow, as if sensing the question, let out a loud caw and took to the sky, circling above them for a moment before flying off in the direction of the nearby hills. Tom watched it go, his mind racing. I think it wants us to follow," he said. Without another word, the family gathered their things, carefully packing the contents of the chest, including the cursed coin. They followed the crow as it flew toward the hills, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. The crow led them through winding paths, over streams, and up rocky inclines until they reached a clearing at the top of a hill. There, standing tall and solitary, was a large stone, weathered and ancient, its surface marked with strange carvings. The crow landed on the stone, its black feathers shimmering in the golden light of the setting sun. "The place where the sun meets the stone," Tom whispered, recalling the words from the letter. This was it. This was where the coin needed to be returned. With trembling hands, Tom approached the stone and placed the coin on its surface. For a moment, nothing happened. The crow remained still, watching them with unblinking eyes. Then, as the last rays of sunlight hit the stone, a faint glow emanated from the coin. The air around them seemed to shift, growing lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. The crow let out one final caw, then spread its wings and took off, disappearing into the sky. The family stood in silence, watching as the glow faded and the coin settled into place on the stone. The curse, it seemed, had been lifted. The family sat around their dining table, the remnants of dinner pushed aside as they discussed the events of the past few days. The crow, with its shiny offerings and the treasure they had uncovered, dominated their conversation. Even after the chest was opened, and they found the coins and the note inside, the family couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper connected them to the bird. Each of them had a different take on what had happened, but they all agreed the crow's presence in their lives was no accident. "I still can't believe it," Sarah, the eldest daughter, said, shaking her head as she absent-mindedly traced a finger along the surface of the old, rusted key that had unlocked the chest. "How could a crow know to bring us that key? It's almost like it was trying to tell us something." Her father, Michael, leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. "Crows are smart, sure. But this goes beyond that. It's like the bird knew exactly where to lead us, knew exactly what we were looking for, even when we didn't." The family had lived in their house for nearly 10 years, and though they had always noticed the crows that frequented their yard, this particular one seemed different. For weeks, it had been coming to their garden, always with something shiny in its beak, a small button, a piece of foil, a metal bottle cap. Each day, it would perch on the fence or the bird bath, dropping its offering at the edge of the flower bed. At first, they had found it amusing, even charming. Sarah had joked that the crow must think of them as royalty, presenting little gifts as tribute. But then the object started to change. The bird brought a small, engraved locket one day, followed by a delicate, old-fashioned key the next. The key was what caught Michael's attention. He had a vague memory of seeing a lock that might match it, and after some searching, he found the old, rusted lock attached to a small, forgotten shed at the back of their garden. The shed had been there long before they moved in, used mostly for storing gardening tools, but none of them had ever thought much about it. The lock was so rusted that it hadn't been opened in years. It was the key the crow had brought that changed everything. The family had gathered around as Michael inserted it into the lock, the metal grinding against the rust as it turned. When the door finally creaked open, they discovered a dusty old box inside, hidden under a pile of ancient, discarded tools. And when they pried open the box, they found the treasure, a collection of old coins, tarnished but still valuable, and a note, its ink faded but legible. The note was addressed to the previous owner of the house, explaining that the chest contained a small inheritance meant to be passed down through the family. Somehow, it had been forgotten, left behind when the house changed hands. But it wasn't just the discovery of the treasure that had the family buzzing with disbelief, it was the role the crow had played. The bird had seemed to know exactly what to bring and when, guiding them step by step toward the shed, toward the hidden chest. It was as if the crow were some sort of guardian, watching over the house and its secrets. "What do you think the note meant when it said the treasure was meant to be passed down?" Sarah asked, her eyes flicking between her parents. "Do you think it was meant for us, somehow?" Michael shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe. Or maybe it was just meant for the last family, and we were the ones who found it by chance. But I don't think the crow showing up was a coincidence. There's something else going on here. I've heard of crows recognizing faces and bringing gifts to people they like," said Emily, the youngest in the family. She had been quietly listening to the conversation, her wide eyes filled with a mix of excitement and curiosity. "Maybe it likes us." Her mother, Rachel, smiled softly at her. "Maybe it does. But even if it does like us, there's more to it than that. It brought us a key that no one else could have known about. It led us to that shed. It wasn't just bringing gifts, it was trying to tell us something." That night, as the family settled into their beds, Michael found himself unable to sleep. His mind was racing with thoughts of the crow, the treasure, and the odd sense of fate that seemed to be woven into the whole situation. He got up and went downstairs, walking to the back door where he could see the garden. The night was still and quiet, the soft chirping of crickets the only sound in the air. But as he looked out toward the garden, something caught his eye. There, perched on the bird bath, was the crow. It was watching him, its head cocked to one side, its black eyes gleaming in the moonlight. Michael stood there for a moment, staring back at the bird. It seemed almost expectant, as if waiting for something. He hesitated, then slowly opened the door and stepped outside. The crow didn't move. It simply sat there, its feathers rustling slightly in the cool night breeze. Michael walked closer, stopping a few feet from the birdbath. He crouched down, eye level with the crow, and whispered, "Why did you bring us that key? What are you trying to tell us?" The crow blinked, its beak opening slightly as if to answer, but no sound came. Michael felt a shiver run down his spine. He had never believed in anything supernatural, but this whole experience was starting to feel like something out of a storybook, a crow with a secret, a treasure, and a family caught up in something they couldn't quite understand. He stood up, still watching the bird, and then, as if deciding the conversation was over, "And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell." The crow spread its wings and flew off into the night, disappearing into the darkness. The next morning, the family gathered in the garden, as they had every morning since the crow started visiting. But this time, there was no shiny object waiting for them. No bottle cap, no key, no trinket. The bird was gone. They waited for hours, hoping it would return, but the crow was nowhere to be seen. Days passed, and still no sign of the crow. The garden felt strangely empty without it. The family had grown accustomed to its daily visits, its gifts, its presence. And now, without the crow, the garden felt quieter, lonelier. But life went on. The family continued their routine, tending to the garden, going to work and school, and slowly, the crow became a memory, something they talked about in passing but no longer waited for. The chest they had found remained in their house, the coins and the note tucked away in a safe place. Occasionally, they would bring it up in conversation, wondering what it all meant, but as time went on, the mystery of the crow began to fade into the background. It wasn't until a few months later, on a chilly autumn morning, that something unusual happened. Michael was in the garden, raking leaves, when he heard the familiar caw of a crow. He looked up, his heart skipping a beat. There, perched on the fence, was the crow, the same crow that had brought them the key, the same one that had disappeared without a trace. It looked at him, and in its beak, it held another shiny object. Michael dropped the rake and walked over to the fence, his eyes locked on the bird. As he got closer, the crow dropped the object at his feet and flew off, leaving Michael standing there, staring at the ground. He crouched down and picked it up. It was another key. This one was different from the first, older, more ornate, with intricate designs etched into the metal. Michael's mind raced as he turned it over in his hand. What could this one open? What new mystery had the crow brought to them now? He called the family outside, and together, they stood around the key, their hearts pounding with excitement and curiosity. The crow had returned, and with it, another puzzle to solve. Michael looked at the key, then at his family. "Looks like we're not done yet," he said with a grin. The crow, now a familiar figure in their lives, had once again delivered a mystery to their doorstep. And as the family gathered around, ready to follow the trail it had left for them, they couldn't help but feel that the crow wasn't just a visitor, it was a guide, leading them to something even greater than they had imagined. And if you like the story, remember to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell.